So, Christian, thanks for being with us today. We are going to talk about character. So I'm going to start with a terribly general question, Socratic question. What is character and why is it important?
That's a big one, though. That could fill the rest of our time together. But first of all, let me say thank you for having me on your show. I've been working on the topic of character for a number of years. And what I wanted to do more recently is try and take a lot of that academic work in philosophy and kind of deliver it or make it more accessible to a larger audience. So in my most recent book, The Character Gap, I start by just defining my terms, trying to be real clear what do we mean by character and what we don't mean. And then after that, I talk about, well, why is it important? Why should we care about this thing? So what is character? I am focused specifically on moral character, which I want to think of as how we are disposed to think, feel, and act when it comes to moral matters. So it has three central components: a thinking component, a feeling component, and a behavioral component. And moral character comes in two broad types. I think of it as involving moral virtue on the one hand and moral vice on the other hand. So to make that less abstract and illustrate what I'm trying to say here, why don't we take a virtue like honesty? That's a trait of character, a character trait, which has a cognitive component that has to do with how we think about the world. In particular, we think it's important to tell the truth, it's important not to cheat, not to steal. A motivational component as well. So an honest person cares about not telling a lie, values the truth, does not want to steal when going to the grocery store. And then ultimately it manifests, if the opportunity arises, in behavior. So the honest person on the stand in the courtroom will tell the truth, and in the shopping mall will not steal from any vendors. So there's the three components I think of as central to moral character. And again, it comes in two varieties: moral virtues like honesty, but also courage, compassion, justice, temperance, fortitude, and others on the list, as well as the flip side, the reverse side, which are the moral vices. So for any virtue, you can think, okay, honesty, dishonesty, courage, cowardice, justice, injustice. So that's my broad framework starting point. And then maybe I'll stop there for the moment. And if we can pick up the other part of your question when it comes to why is it important. But hopefully that was fairly clear.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christian. So there seems to be both a psychological dimension to character, and there seems to be a behavioral, which I would suggest, which I think you mean is like in terms of the activities that we pursue, in terms of the actions, or in terms of concrete practices in order to enable us to be, I guess, virtuous.
Yeah, so I would think of behavioral, it could take two forms. It could take the form of just momentary discrete actions, and then it would also take a larger form in terms of long-term practices and activities, which is what you were talking about. So I'm thinking that an honest person will, when on the stand in the courtroom on Friday, April 26th, when asked a question, will tell the truth. That's a discrete particular action that manifests that person's virtue of honesty. But that's a very narrow perspective on that person's character. Over time, you would also expect an honest person to manifest a cross-situationally consistent pattern of honest behavior. So not just in the courtroom, but also at the bar, in the office, at home, wherever the person happens to be, where honesty can come into play. And also a stable pattern of behavior. So not just on that Friday, but the next Friday, the next Friday, the next Friday, weeks, months, years into the future. So I would say the behavioral aspect of character shows up both in the short run, in momentary actions or discrete instances of behavior, as well as longer term patterns, which we see both across situations and over time.
That makes sense to me. Christian. So what I'm like to ask about then with character, it seems to be a distinction you're operating with between, for want of a better word, feeling and emotion, and transitive dispositions, if I could put it in those terms, where someone has as you say, a stable pattern of attributes across a period of time. Would that be right?
Yeah, so maybe I think so, but you can tell me if we're not using the terms the same way. I think of it working this way. What's fundamental here is that a person with a character trait has a certain psychological disposition. So the psychological is primary. When that disposition gets triggered, say when a compassionate person has a trait of compassion and sees someone in need, say sees someone who's has dropped papers or has a broken leg and needs to go to the hospital, that observation of the situation can trigger in that person's mind his or her trait of compassion, which can, in that instance, give rise to feelings and thoughts pertaining to what to do in this particular situation. So if it's seeing the person with a broken leg, that can trigger the person's virtue of compassion, which can give rise, for example, to feelings, altruistic feelings, selfless feelings of wanting to help that person, more specifically, help get that person to the hospital to get the leg taken care of, and also trigger beliefs about how best to help that person, what means to take to get that person the help that he or she needs. So those what I would say are like the temporary, momentary feelings, but they are given rise to, or they are caused by, a more fundamental psychological disposition, the virtue of compassion. And in those feelings and beliefs, in turn, we're still at the psychological level, all these feelings and beliefs, in turn, can give rise to overt, external, manifest behavior. Say in the form of walking over, helping the person get in your car, and driving the person to the hospital. So that's a little bit more about how I'm thinking about these things.
Okay, now what I want to ask you next is, I guess, to do with specifically the word character, because in everyday usage at least, because what you're offering is a theory of character, I think, which is clearly quite nuanced and rich. When we use the word character in everyday sense, I mean, I think you said the word in your book, you talked about sort of, everyday speech, we say moral fiber, sort of, like good moral backbone or a strength of character. When we use the word character in that regard, it seems to be something that is something unified, which unites all of these different dispositions or these different virtues that we have. So I'm wondering, is that what's at play in when you're thinking about it? Is for someone to have a good character or a bad character, I guess, does it require a unification of a manifold or several or a few specific virtues?
Good. So I want to make two different points here. One is a point about taxonomy. I'm focused on moral character, but the concept of character is broader than moral character. Moral character is just one kind of character. There can also be other kinds, say intellectual character. There might be athletic character. There might be prudential character. There might be religious character, aesthetic character. So that's a whole other set of issues there if we want to dive into other kinds of character. I just hone in on the moral. And within the moral realm, we want to say, okay, someone's a morally good person, as opposed to morally behaves well. So I'm focused on the internal aspects of the person. I want to say someone's a morally good person, and we are really meaning that about their character, their moral character in general, then yes, that means that person will have to instantiate or have to embody all the different moral virtues. Now, often when we say that, I think we're speaking a little bit looser. We're not thinking about, okay, is this a morally good person? And we go through a checklist of, justice, check, temperance, check, courage, check, compassion, check. Okay, we check all the boxes, then conclusion, morally good. What we're probably thinking of is something that's salient to us at the moment. So we say, this is a morally good person because recently we've been seeing them donating a lot of their time to famine relief, or we've seen them exercise lots of self-control. So that's kind of jumping from this one character trait or a couple related character traits to a broader ascription of they are a morally good person. But if you want me to be philosophically careful, I would say someone is only truly morally good if they have all the moral virtues. So that, or if you want to say perfectly morally good, you have to have all the moral virtues. And that's what I think is required.
Okay, thank you. Very succinct. So that begs the question, what are the moral virtues then?
Yes. And that invites lots of different avenues to explore. So the short answer is that there's no widely accepted list. And in fact, there's been, historically lots of controversy. So we look at the list provided by Aristotle, and we compare that to the list, say, that arose from the Judeo-Christian tradition and imbibed in, say, the work of Aquinas. We compare that to the list that Nietzsche provides us, and we look at other contemporary lists, and we see some overlap and some sometimes some sharp divergence. So how would we kind of work this out? Well, one way is to go through those lists and see what we personally agree with and say, should we put humility on the list or should we not put humility on the list? Should we put chastity on the list? Should we not put chastity on the list, to cite two controversial examples? So that's a discussion we could have. And I have my own views about what belongs on the list and what doesn't belong on the list. There's another way to go that I'll just mention, and that's a more empirical route that has been used by psychologists in the field of positive psychology. So positive psychology is a subfield of personality psychology that emerged really in the last 20 years. And as its name suggests, it's trying to focus on the more positive aspects of human beings, whereas psychology has tended to focus on rather more ways which we fall short or mess up in various ways. So what one of the hallmarks and main accomplishments of positive psychology has been to come up with a list of 24 character strengths, is what they call them, but what we would call them virtues. And how they arrived at that list was by doing a very extensive cross-cultural analysis. So they are not trying to do normative ethics. They're not trying to be prescriptive. They were just doing more sociological, empirical work, saying, okay, can we look across philosophical systems, religious traditions, even things like Hallmark greeting cards and Pokemon, game cards and things like this, and find a kind of common core of virtues that have had historical and cross-cultural significance to them. And, I wasn't involved in that project, and I can't comment on all the steps they went through, but the upshot is that they've arrived at these 24 character strengths, which are now widely used in at least psychological research on moral character. So that's another place we might go to look for a list of moral virtues.
24 sounds like a lot, Christian. Sounds very demanding.
It is a lot. And there's actually some controversy about whether they got them all. So, for example, they don't have patience on the list. And I would make the case that patience belongs on the list. So that you're right. How I think about that is, if we are supposed to be working on all 24 at the same time in order to try and become a good person, I find myself kind of getting discouraged and saying it's too much to juggle. Also, if a school system is doing a kind of virtue of the month program, and they're, like over the course of 2 or 3 years, they're trying to get through all the 24, but, here's patience month, here's compassion month, here's forgiveness month. I'm also somewhat skeptical about how effective that is, whether you can really move the needle on a virtue by spending a month on it or in some cases even a week on it. So my way of thinking about it is more like this. When we come into the topic of character improvements and trying to develop a better character, rather than looking at all 24, I want to say, let's do some self-examination of ourselves and try to identify 2 or 3 areas, recognizing that there are likely more, recognizing that we probably don't do a good job of approximating any virtue. Where are we really falling short? And that's going to be an individual by individual matter. And let's, start there and target those areas of weakness, through some strategies and some intentional efforts, try to move the needle gradually over the course of months and years, if it takes that, in those areas, and then move on to other ones.
So when we're trying to cultivate these virtues or these habits, I suppose, because when I think of the word character, I automatically jump to Aristotle because he's the obvious one to think about. So if I recall the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says a virtue is a habit connected to a choice. Then, therefore, that means that in some sense we need to be a rational agent and we need to make a choice. So choices have to come in at some point. We are, if we want to engage in a set of practices that will make us attain the virtues that will enable us to have a good character. But on the other level, we have to do that. Our dispositions are not rational, or they're not immediately aware, at least aware, present to our self-consciousness. For Aristotle, then there's a slight paradox in it. I mean, I think the word is, how does he put it? It's like hexis, I think. He says that, a habit works for good or bad, I guess. Or a virtue or a vice works when it becomes second nature, right? When it's become something that we forget. Right, so that means that's something I think quite challenging when trying to acquire the dispositions that will lead us to a flourishing life.
Yes, I entirely agree. So let me provide a little bit of context about how I think about it, and then ultimately I'm just going to end up agreeing with you. So in Aristotle's framework, he has at least the basics of it. He has 4 different categories. He's got vice, incontinence, continence, and virtue. There's more to it than that. For Aristotle scholars, they would give me some more categories, but this will be enough for now. So vice and virtue share this feature. They're like second nature. When you exhibit them, you're wholehearted in exhibiting them. You're not internally conflicted. And that's what you just said about virtue, and that kind of flow state that you're in is also going to be true of vice. Of course, the orientation is the opposite. In the case of vice, you're oriented towards the bad. In the case of virtue, you're oriented towards the good. Aristotle thinks most people don't start out either virtuous or vicious. They start out somewhere in between. And that's also my view as well. I think the empirical research, which we can get into later if you like, supports the idea that most of us don't start out either virtuous or vicious, but somewhere in a middle space between the two. But as we make progress in getting better, if we do make progress, what we can see is a movement towards more wholeheartedness and less towards internal conflict. So that brings in the other 2 categories, continence and incontinence for Aristotle. So incontinence is know the right thing to do, but you often give in to temptation and end up doing the wrong thing. And continence is knowing the right thing to do and still doing the right thing, but you have to struggle and engage with some internal conflict first before you end up doing the right thing. And for a lot of us, when we succeed in doing the right thing, which is great, we're not yet at that wholehearted level. We might have to overcome some temptation or some conflicts before we can reliably do the right thing. So I was just giving a little bit more background on Aristotle here. Now, just to agree with you there, since I don't think on empirical grounds we are even at the continent level, most of us, we first have to get to that stage, that level of reliably, cross-situationally doing the right thing. Even if we have to overcome temptation, it's hard enough just to get to that stage where our behavioral pattern is a virtuous pattern. And then from there, we have to go another stage yet, which is one where the motivation harmonizes with what we know what the right thing to do is. And so it becomes second nature. We just naturally do the right thing as opposed to having to struggle to do anything. So no disagreement with you. It's going to be very challenging.
Connected to that, let's say someone who's in a dire or adverse situation. Let's say someone who's got a severe addiction to heroin, right? And they're engaging in a whole pile of destructive activities surrounding that. I'm pretty sure you've thought about this, so I'm wondering what you would say to that person, say. Or, and it doesn't necessarily have to be someone, it doesn't necessarily have to be a heroin addict. It could be an alcoholic or someone with any other compulsive behavior. How does that person, I suppose depending on the severity of the situation, how does that person use or cultivate their dispositions if they are at the whim of, say addiction or compulsive instincts?
I'm not probably well versed to answer that because I worry that I'm not well enough informed about the latest literature on things like addiction. So why I hesitate here is because what I'm thinking about is traits of character and cultivating good traits of character, working against bad traits of character, which I think of, as you already mentioned, as within the realm of our control and part of our rational agency. And I see a lot of people, and I've read some of this literature too, say that things like heroin addiction, this is something outside of our control and not subject to our free will, if you want to use that term, or at least our voluntary control. So then it becomes a conversation about other types of treatments, drug treatments and so forth that take us outside of areas where I feel like I'm really expert to be able to discourse about.
Sure, I suppose what I'm getting at is the idea of instincts, really. In some senses, how do we... Now, I suppose an addiction is not necessarily an instinct, not necessarily at least, or addictive behavior or compulsive behavior is not necessarily an instinct. But, I mean, I'm wondering for you, is there such a thing as someone who has moral instincts, I guess? Or is there someone who can cultivate those moral instincts to be a more flourishing, cultivated, morally nuanced character?
Yeah, so it would depend a lot what we mean by instincts, or
Sure.
feelings or emotions or whatnot. I do think it's possible, and I think it actually happens. One way I might be able to fill out the story a little bit is by bringing in one of the strategies that I talk about in the book about how to cultivate virtue. And it's a strategy which I think would have something to say to this question. So, in the book, towards the end of the book, I talk about how there are different strategies for trying to become a better person that we can intentionally try to employ in our lives. And I talk about strategies that I don't think are very promising, and then I go over some strategies that I do think are quite promising. And one of them has to do with moral exemplars and role models.
Sure.
And so the idea here is that we might not be virtuous ourselves, but we can hopefully find in our lives people who exhibit virtue, and then we can see them as role models, not just for how to behave, but also for how to think and feel. And so that's the connection back to your question. So to put a little bit more meat on that, there's these role models can take different forms. They can be historical role models. They can be contemporary role models. They can be fictional role models. They don't have to be real people. They can be, of course, real people as well. They can be distinguished, famous people. They can be people who are our neighbors or work in our same building with us. And the thought is we could see their behavior and admire what they've done in some aspect of their life. We can admire what Abraham Lincoln did in telling the truth. We can admire what Harriet Tubman did in helping free slaves. And that can have, in turn, this emotion of admiration, can in turn have another emotional response of inspiration, to want to become like them, and not just in our behavior, but in how we see the world cognitively and how we emotionally respond to the world. So to feel the same things that Harriet Tubman felt about the suffering of slaves, to care about the truth as much as Abraham Lincoln did, even long before he was president. So that's one area where I would want to spell it out, I think, a little bit more along the lines of what you're asking.
So is it for you the case then that, well, we use the word character traits, don't we, very cheaply in everyday conversation. So are character traits then for you different to, say, so in some sense character traits are more fundamental or substantial in some way than, say, things which are accidentally attached to us, such as, I don't know, the colour of our skin or the colour of our eyes or the colour of our hair or whatever? Does that make sense?
It does. It would really depend on how we spell out the distinction. In one sense, moral character traits are not essential to us because we can have them or not have them. So on my view, the empirical research these days from psychology tells a story according to which most people do not have any moral virtues at all. So in that sense, they're very accidental because most people don't have them. And it's also true on my reading of the empirical literature that most people don't have the moral vices either. So they're also accidental in one sense of accidental. Now, there could be this other sense, though, essential for being a morally good person. So the virtues, not all character traits, but the moral virtues would be essential for being a morally good person, and the moral vices would be essential for being a morally bad person. So I think I would want to be real careful how I was using the terminology and say moral virtues are essential in one sense to being a morally good person, but they're not essential in another sense because most people, in fact, don't have them.
Okay, and that's a good place to segue to talking about the bad folk of the world. When we're talking about character, then, in that regard, it's not something essential. It's not something absolute about the attributes a person has acquired across the span of their life. But then you can also equally say that someone has a bad character, right? You know,
That's correct.
in your book, you talk about Joseph Stalin. You mentioned him briefly. You draw a comparison with him to Mother Teresa. So we take Stalin. So we got what we got there. We got a brutal dictator, someone who engaged in heinous acts to a humongous degree. So I'm just say someone like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be Stalin per se, but I'm thinking about what are the things that about a character that makes such a nefarious individual come to be.
Well, so that sounds like a developmental question. How did his character form over time and be shaped in that kind of direction? And for that particular individual, I'd have to research his life history and know a lot more about his upbringing and things like that, which I don't know, frankly, anything about. So let me step back one level and kind of sketch how I think about these matters with good and bad. So there are empirical questions here and there are philosophical questions. On empirical grounds, I think most people, here I'm relying on the psychological research that goes back 50 years in social psychology and in personality psychology. I think the empirical story that emerges there is that most people are not like Stalin, thank goodness. Most of us are not bad people, even to a lesser extent than Stalin. Most of us have a character which is in the middle, roughly speaking, between virtue and vice. But I say most over and over again because I think there are outliers. So it's a bell curve. On the one hand, you have your virtuous people. Pick your favorite example, Lincoln for honesty, Mother Teresa for compassion. And then on the other hand, you have your other outliers, your vice outliers, like Stalin and Hitler, who's on the cover of the book. So I take both of those categories to be exceptional individuals. In one case, exceptionally good. The other case, exceptionally bad. The philosophical questions here tend to do, I think, with how we unpack the concept of a moral vice. For example, does it involve a wholeheartedness requirement that you have to be wholeheartedly pursuing the bad, like we already talked about with respect to the good? Does it mean that in order to be a vicious person, you have to have good intentions and yet fail? Or do you have to have evil intentions? So does a vicious person want to bring about bad things as a person understands the bad? Or could you be a vicious person who has good intentions but just gets it seriously wrong? So you wanted to make the world a better place. You're just radically mistaken about what would make the world a better place. So those are some of the philosophical questions that arise. And I guess we could say a third category, which you've introduced, is developmental. So how is it that over time, someone starts out as an infant, a young child, teenager, and then eventually ends up like Stalin with his clearly vicious character? And for that last set of questions, we need to draw on the resources of autobiographies and biographies and also developmental psychological work on how children develop over time. So that's probably not something I have a lot to say about in the case of Stalin, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the developmental side of it is interesting because in some sense, I suppose, was rather chilling thought, really, isn't it? That because we become things, don't we? We come from somewhere we are somewhere and we're going somewhere. And we therefore we come from certain temperaments, certain moral temperaments, certain vices. We come from certain virtues and, we have certain intentions about trying to overcome some of our vices or, or try to perfect some of our virtues even. But in some sense, it's rather chilling, I suppose, that any of us could become Stalin. Well, maybe not necessarily Stalin, but potentially a very bad person.
That is correct. It's possible. There are questions about likelihood, but it's possible. That's right. So if we think about the developmental aspects that are central here, one aspect is genetic. So there is good evidence that part of our personality and our personality traits, which would include our character traits, are genetically influenced. Another key component here is upbringing, of course, and parental structure, society that one is raised in, kind of education, including moral education that one receives. And another component of this, especially later in life, is choice and what kind of choices one makes when one's at an age where one can make more autonomous free choices and deliberate amongst options. And so, depending on your genetics and your upbringing, that's going to slant things a certain direction. You're not going to, by the time you're a teenager, you're not going to have a blank slate. You're going to definitely be skewed in certain directions, hopefully good, but not always, as we know. But from there on, yes, you can, through your own choices, shape your character in a variety of different directions. Now, it's not the kind of thing which happens overnight. So you can't just flip a switch, take a magic pill, and go from being honest to dishonest or dishonest to honest. But you can embark upon a certain path of life or engage in certain activities which over time will gradually cultivate particular character dispositions in your character. So to make that less abstract, one can choose one year to cheat on your taxes and then the next year face the same situation again and choose to do it again and choose to do it year after year, so that eventually after 10 years or 20 years, it just becomes, something you just don't even give any thought to anymore. It's what you're naturally going to do as a result of the earlier free choices you made for yourself. So yes, the short answer is it is possible to embark on a path of vice.
Indeed. I think, I'm not sure if I agree with Aristotle on this next point, but I think at one point Aristotle said that it's impossible for a young person or say a child to be virtuous because the acquisition of the virtues and the virtuous dispositions is a lifelong task, and it's something you acquire with experience and thought and wisdom and sagacity and trial and error and all of these different things. But I wonder, you and I both have children, I know this. So what do you think of that? Like, when you look at, say, children, do you think that they are, like Aristotle says, in some sense, have a deficit of character? Do you think that would be fair to say?
It sounds strong to me, and I'm not sure. I think I share with
me
you.
Me too, yeah.
Some concerns about Aristotle's view here. I would say it's a very, preliminary or nascent character. It's just starting out. But I would be very hesitant to say that we have to wait until 50 or 60 or 70, to decide, or to achieve virtue, or to, in the case of judging others, to decide whether someone has achieved virtue. So I would think of this as a continuum and a gradual matter. And there's probably no magic number or magic threshold. But to me, it seems possible that someone could be a compassionate person in their 20s, or an honest person in their 30s, depending upon their own upbringing and life circumstances. One of the reasons why Aristotle wanted to put the bar pretty high is because he thinks practical wisdom is necessary and essential to all the moral virtues. You have to be a practically wise person. And there's a lot packed into being practically wise. There's a lot of criteria you have to meet. But for me, I guess I tend to try to have a broader tense, and picture here. And I would want to say, virtue can come in degrees, and to be a perfectly virtuous person, well, I don't think anyone has ever been a perfectly virtuous person, but to be a perfectly virtuous person, yeah, you have the bar set very, very high. But if there's such a thing as strong virtue, moderate virtue, weak virtue, and then we get out of the virtue taxonomy category and get into other categories like continence, incontinence, and so forth. Well, if there's such a thing as weak virtue, moderate virtue, strong virtue, then I see no reason why someone in their 20s or 30s couldn't achieve at least weak or moderate virtue.
That makes perfect. Well, firstly, that's a much nicer way of putting it than I sort of ventriloquated Aristotle. I suppose what I'm interested in is with a deficit of character. And I think you've spoken to that in your answer to my last question. But it is essential to your book, this notion of deficit, I think. It's in the title, the character gap. So when you're talking about a gap in character, I don't think you're necessarily saying that now in this great modern age, people are lacking character. I think what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, you're talking more specifically about the gap between, well, the actual and the possible, I suppose, where we are now and where we're going. Is that correct?
Yeah, almost. Very, very close. It's the gap between the actual and the possible. That's correct. It's the gap between our actual character and the character we should have. So the possible could take lots of different forms. It could be a good character, it could be a bad character. Lots of things are possible. The character gap that I'm really, really focused on is the gap between the actual and the good, or the character we should have. So just to expand on that a little bit more. So philosophy can say quite a bit about what virtues are, why we should be virtuous, and what the standards are that we have to meet in order to develop a virtuous character. I use psychology quite a bit to tell us what our actual character looks like. How are we doing? Are we, in fact, virtuous? Are we vicious? Are we somewhere in between? And as a result of looking at lots of these experiments, like the Milgram experiment and Darlene Batson's experiment and, famous ones throughout history of psychology, I come to the conclusion that our actual character does not map onto, for most of us, does not map onto the kind of character we should have, which is a virtuous character. So the philosophy helps me understand what kind of character we should have. The psychology helps me understand the kind of character we actually have. And I say there's a gap between the two, a significant gap. Our character actually falls short of what it should like. And that's why at the end of the book I say, well, what can we do proactively to try and shrink that gap or diminish that gap to have our actual character better reflect the kind of character we should have?
That's fascinating, Christian, because in some sense, and I can see kind of the Aristotelian lineage come to the fore there, because in some sense the good is a telos, right? It's not something quite present, but it's always an issue for us in some sense, almost in an existential sense.
Yes.
The good is not there, but it's constantly hanging around. It's constantly calling us forth and drawing us towards it.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Go on, Christian.
Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to speak over you. That's exactly the view, right? So I think there is this notion of good character, and I think this notion is appealing and something we should strive towards. And it comes in degrees, but there is, if there is a perfect character, that would be the ultimate telos to try to develop. That's unrealistic and unattainable, but we can at least work towards it. And so in the Character Gap book, I spent a chapter trying to make this good as appealing as possible. So I try to give different arguments and reasons to support the idea that this is something we should really care about. Maybe we haven't spent it, we're very busy, we've got a lot going on, especially these days. Our attention can be diverted to different things, but I tried to outline a number of different reasons why becoming a good person and striving towards this telos is something that we should really prioritize and care a lot more about.
Indeed. So what strategies should we adopt then, Christian, do you think, for working towards that telos, working towards that sort of virtual guiding light?
Sure. Yep. So here we get into character improvement and development, and we've touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is a great chance to expand some more. I'll give you 3 strategies, and if you want to probe any of them in more detail afterwards, just let me know. So I have already mentioned one of them, which is to seek out role models and exemplars of virtue in our lives, and have them help us fill out the picture of what it is to live a virtuous life, have them inspire us to become more like them and be motivated to live the kind of life that they're living, morally speaking. So we touched on that earlier when we were talking about people like Abraham Lincoln and Harriet Tubman. So I'll set that one to one side. A second strategy, which I think is important, is the value of having more reminders in our lives. So there's lots of evidence that people psychologically can get off track, morally speaking, when they focus on something that's in their self-interest at the expense of doing the right thing. And what moral reminders can do is bring back to our conscious attention the importance of acting well. That's very abstract. Let me give you a concrete illustration of this. In a recent set of studies having to do with cheating behavior, some researchers would have participants come into the lab, take a test, be told that they would be paid 50 cents per correct answer. There was no opportunity to cheat. They took the test, 20 problems, and on average, they would get about 7 problems correct. Another group of participants would come in, take the same test, 50 cents per correct answer, 20 problems, except they were told that they would grade their own materials afterwards, dispose of their answer key and just verbally report however many answers they got correct. Well, here in one study, there was a difference between 7 correct answers in the control group versus 14 in this, we could say, cheating opportunity group. Now, that's not the end of the story. The third group of participants came into the lab. They were students. They had to sign their university's honor code and pledge their honor that they were not going to cheat. Then they took the test, 50 cents per correct answer, 20 problems. They got to grade it themselves, verbally report, and their cheating was eliminated. So why do I mention this research? Well, because it's a dramatic, I think, illustration of the value of having a moral reminder in our lives. What was the moral reminder? It was the honor code. Signing the honor code brought to our attention, or in this case, the students' attention, the importance of honesty and not cheating, and it subsequently prevented them from doing something that they might have otherwise done. So that's a illustration of the second idea of moral reminders. And those can take lots of different forms. They could be starting the day with a certain reading. They could be at the end of the day doing a journal where you reflect back over the choices you made during the day. It could be getting text messages that come on your phone, reminding you of the importance of things like helping others and the like. Okay. The last one, just to keep this brief, last strategy I'll mention is what I call getting the word out. And this has to do with increasing our self-awareness and self-understanding of our own moral flaws, where aspects of our psychology which are holding us back from being a virtuous person, including aspects which might be unconscious or functioning unconsciously until we learn that they are there and having an impact. And I'll give one illustration of this to see what that means. So for a long time, we've known from the psychological research that people in groups will not often help in emergency situations. So if I'm in a group and everyone else isn't doing anything and an emergency is going on, like someone's collapsed on the side of the road, it's very unlikely I will do anything myself. This is the bystander effect or the group effect. This is very surprising when you tell these results to most, lay people who have never been exposed to this research. They're very surprised to hear this because we underappreciate the role of things like fear of embarrassment and diffusion of responsibility and how they can have a big psychological impact on our behavior. Well, getting the word out involves gaining greater understanding of what we are like, learning some of this research, appreciating the impact of fear of embarrassment, for example, and then when we are in future situations where we might have otherwise acted badly, we can be on guard and work against those tendencies to not help or to hurt people or to lie, cheat, or steal. So to sum it up in one sentence, the 3 strategies which I recommend are the importance of moral exemplars, the use of moral reminders, and the value of self-consciousness and self-awareness.
Okay, thank you, Chris. And I suppose I should ask the converse then as well. What are the things we should avoid for improving our character to work towards that good?
Yeah, there are some strategies for improving character, which I don't think are very helpful, and so I set them to the side. And then there's just the kind of question you're really getting at, which is which things should you be on the guard against or be on the lookout to avoid that could really set you on the wrong path. And here I would say I'll give you one idea that comes to mind, which is being careful to select your situations ahead of time. By that I mean sometimes when we get into a situation, we can get swept away by what's going on in the situation. And so situations of temptation are like this, whether it's a food temptation or a drinking temptation. When we get in the situation, we can find that our self-control is eroded and we can get swept along. And so one thing to guard against and be mindful of is if you see those situations on the horizon, don't trust in your own willpower, but try to avoid the situation coming up in the first place. Try to instead pivot to a different situation and avoid having to confront the demands of the tempting situation. So philosopher John Doris gives a now widely used example of this, where you're married and your significant other is out of town, and there's been this person who's been a little bit flirtatious with you in recent weeks at the office, and this person suggests, knowing that your significant other is out of town, this person suggests, would you like to go out for drinks, or would you like to get an apartment and watch a movie, or whatever the case might be? Well, you could trust your own self-control and say, I'm faithful. I'm not going to worry about, whatever might happen. I'll be strong, and go anyway. I would caution against that. And instead recommend don't get yourself into those situations in the first place, because often the demands of the situation will have a greater impact on us than we might have predicted beforehand.
Okay, so I've got one more question, I think, for you, Christian, and probably a bit unfair. So in terms of moral exemplars, then, is there anybody you have in mind, or somebody who would embody, either living or dead, or even fictional, as you said yourself, that would embody the characteristics of a good character, that would, I suppose, draw together all of the different virtues that you're talking about, and would balance the psychological and the behavioral?
Right. First, I'll say most of the exemplars that we think of are only exemplars of one virtue or a small handful of virtues. So someone like Abraham Lincoln was an exemplar of honesty, but I wouldn't say he was exemplar of all the virtues. On the cover of the book, I have Gandhi, but as many people point out to me, Gandhi had some real areas of moral weakness as well. So normally when I'm thinking of exemplars, I'm thinking of them as exemplars of one or at most a couple related virtues. The one exception I would point to now in the second part of my answer, getting directly to your question, well, this becomes more personal, which is I would, as a person of faith myself, I would say someone like Jesus would be the closest moral exemplar for me personally, as someone who embodies all the virtues, cognitively, psychologically, and behaviorally. Now in the Christian tradition, it's a little bit, it's a little bit of an unfair example, because he was supposed to be fully divine as well as fully human. So he got a lot of help. You could put it that way, from that perspective. But otherwise, if we put that example to one side, I don't think there are any, other examples that I can think of at the moment of someone who's perfectly virtuous.
Well, Machiavelli says, of course, wasn't it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions? I think it was Machiavelli that said that. Don't hold me to that.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Professor Christian Miller, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.